Hello, students. In today's lecture, I wish to discuss about the final, element on climate change under the international climate policy, and that is the climate finance. Well, when it comes to climate finance, it is, I believe, one of the most important elements of the climate negotiation because everything revolves around this entire schematic of climate finance, as it is the heart of all the commitments. And without climate finance, I believe none of the other elements will materialize. So, when it comes to climate finance, what exactly we understand all of it? Now, finance basically refers to local, national, or even transnational financing, which are basically drawn from not just public sources but also several other alternative and private sources. Well, initially the emphasis was primarily on public sources or public finances, but gradually they had to switch to other alternative sources. And the basic objective of the financing is to support mitigation, adaptation actions, and several such other elements of climate change. I mean, it can be also technology transfer. It can be uh, capacity building, and we have all realized, in fact, since inception, from the convention, the Kyoto Protocol, and finally in the Paris Agreement, that there is a dire need for financial assistance from the parties with more financial resources to other parties, those who are less endowed and more vulnerable. So there is a need for immense investments to meet the climate related challenges around the globe. And this includes something which I have used here as green investments. And when it comes to less endowed and more vulnerable countries, it's the least developed countries, even the developing countries, and how far their climate policies are in tandem with the long term welfare objectives. That is another element of it because here comes the major challenge. As you all know, the basic idea behind this is you cannot obstruct the developmental objectives of these countries, this less endowed and more vulnerable from the angle of climate and less endowed from the angle of finance and economic strength. These countries, they do also have concern for environment, but at the same point of time they have a very clear idea that they have to reach an economic development or so-called sustainable development. That's the idea is. Now, when it comes to the economic dimension of the climate policy, it's basically dominated by some market-based mechanisms. I believe I have already discussed in the previous lecture on Kyoto Protocol, where I talked about some market-based mechanisms, the clean development mechanism, then joint implementation, international carbon trading. So it bottoms down to the two types of economic market-based way of ensuring there is a climate oriented trading, also called the carbon trading. So it can be in form of a taxation scheme or in form of a practice commonly known as cap and trade. So you have the carbon tax or cap and trade. India, for example, opted for carbon taxation, right, which includes internalization of the cost, which will of course be borne by the polluter in the first place. And cap and trade is basically put a ceiling or a cap on a particular emission limit, and based on that only they will go ahead with respect to their necessary plans. Now the thing is that even you can refer to some of the articles I came across. One piece by Richard Kozelwright and Rob Voss, and of course Frank Ankerman. It was from Bloomsbury Academic, and it is on financing the development need response to climate change, climate protection, and development. They are edited by this. I mean, these people edited this book, and I'll send across this particular material to all of you. Now, in accordance to this principle of common but differentiated responsibility, which we have already discussed as one of the core principles of the Framework Convention, it in a way sets out that the developed country parties are to provide financial resources to assist developing country parties in implementing the objectives of the Framework Convention. And this has also been reaffirmed in Paris Agreement, which in fact talks about the obligations of the developed countries, while for the first time, which also encourages voluntary contributions by the other countries. This is a different. This element of voluntary contribution was not there in the Framework Convention, although it was tabled in the Copenhagen Accord. But in Paris Agreement, it's quite clear they have also taken a different route. There's a voluntary contribution, encouraging voluntary contribution. Now, the developed country parties, they are the one who should continue to take the lead in mobilizing the climate finance. Now, they have to. This is the major challenge here because, not all the developed countries are okay with it. I mean, starting with United States itself, they have their reasons for not funding climate-related, objectives. The thing is that they have their own priorities, and this is a difficulty which we'll face because this principle, common but differentiated responsibility, this principle also is also not a customary international principle. But when it comes to mobilizing the climate finance, it's also there are several developed countries, European countries especially. They have taken like series of such actions in order to mobilize climate finance from time to time. And this ranges from a variety of sources, instruments, channels, because they play a very significant role of public funds and through a variety of actions, which includes, say, for example, supporting country driven strategies or even taking into account the needs and the priorities of the developing country parties. So, such mobilization of climate finance basically represents a progression which is beyond previous efforts. So, now it is a very cardinal thing to note here that all these governments or stakeholders, in order to render such climate-related finance mobilization, they have to understand and assess the financial needs of the developing countries or even other vulnerable countries, least developed countries, small island countries, for example. And they do also have to understand that how these financial resources can be mobilized. So the provision for these resources should be there to achieve a balance between all the elements. In fact, be it adaptation, be it mitigation. Usually, mitigation requires more funding in comparison to adaptation, but overall, the efforts are pretty much apparent. And even in under Paris Agreement, there has been a clear guidance that the aim is of making this finance flows consistent with a pathway towards a very low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development. And assessing the progress in the mobilization or even the provision of support is also a part of the global stock take, which I have mentioned in previous occasion. I believe it's something which is their unique factor under Paris Agreement, which in fact emphasizes on transparency. It emphasizes on enhancing the predictability of financial support. Now, when it comes to the financial mechanisms, there are several elements to that. Now, in order to ensure that the financial requirement for climate action, first and foremost, there is a necessity to meet the full incremental costs of implementing all these adaptation and mitigation activities. It also includes climate research, training, management of carbon sinks, right? And there is a sectoral approach which has been taken for all these things. When I'm saying sectoral approach, I mean sector specific, like, for example, industries, forestry, transport, real estate, energy. These are the sectors, prime sectors. And sectoral approach, in fact, deals with like whatever mitigation action you're taking, be it with respect to forestry, be it with respect to industry, be it with respect to agriculture. That is somewhere you will find is where your individual laws also play a very significant role. Now, that is where we have to also apply our mind. Now, if we are talking about, say, for example, transport, let's pick the example. Like, let's take the example of India. Now we have Motor Vehicles Act, right, and we also have this recent amendments which emphasizes on penalty, right, and at the same point of time, if you see other legislations which in fact is related to motor vehicle emissions, say for example the Air Pollution Prevention Control Act, there also you will come across. In fact, the rules are also there. In fact, the pollution control boards are there, which from time to time adopt several quality standards. So, but at the same point of time, we have to also understand what kind of measures we are taking, which are very much progressive, which are very much climate resilient. Taking that into account, it will take you down to the, I believe, if you're aware of it, the 2008 National Action Plan on Climate Change. And the National Action Plan on Climate Change identifies several missions, if I'm not wrong, 8 missions. Wind energy is one mission, solar energy is one mission, so on and so forth. So these climate resilient missions are basically uh, very much in the side of resilience. Now, when it comes to these conventions, these public and private financing of these climate-related actions, there are a few things which I need to discuss here. Now, public and private finance, as I was saying, is something which it is something there you will find that in order to facilitate the provision of the climate finance, these are the two basic sources. Now, along with this UNFCCC framework, there are also certain parallel framework which has been adopted by some regional groups. Now, but the bottom line here is that the convention, in the very first place, established a financial mechanism to provide financial resources to developing country parties and several other least developed countries. Now, this financial mechanism also serves the Kyoto Protocol as well as the Paris Agreement. Now, the convention, in fact, states that the operation of the financial mechanism can be entrusted to more than one existing international entities. And initially, it was the Global Environmental Facility, commonly known as GEF, which was serving as an operating entity of the financial mechanism under the Framework Convention. However, in 2011, a fund was created. This fund is known as Green Climate Fund (GCF), and in 2011 it was designated as the operating entity for financial mechanism. Now, this financial mechanism basically is accountable to the Conference of Parties, and it decides on the policies, program priorities, eligibility criteria for funding. And in addition to that, it also guides to the GEF, which was there in addition to providing guidance to the Global Environmental Facility and the Green Climate Fund. The parties also have established some other special funds. For that, you should refer to the Framework Convention's official climate finance website. You will come across these details. There is a special climate change fund, and there is a least developed countries fund. And in addition to that, even the Kyoto Protocol created a fund known as the Adaptation Fund. From the term itself, it's quite apparent. The Special Climate Change Fund, Least Developed Countries Fund, Adaptation Fund, it's quite self explanatory that they were created with an objective to address the needs of specific countries and specific climate related activities. When it comes to the the Least Developed Countries Fund, it is managed by the Global Environmental Facility even now. However, the adaptation fund, which was established by Kyoto Protocol, it basically gets its money or so-called its all contributions from all those three market-based mechanisms that I've mentioned under the Kyoto Protocol discussion, like green CDM or joint implementation or international emission trading. So, when it comes to Paris Climate Change Conference in 2015, the parties also agreed that the operating entity of the financial mechanisms, be it the Green Climate Fund or the other thing, the SP and all these special funds that you have created, they will all serve the Paris Agreement. And regarding the Adaptation Fund, the serving the Paris Agreement negotiation is also underway, and there has been an ad hoc working group which was created on Paris Agreement to look into that. But in 2010, I remember during COP16, if I'm not wrong, the parties decided to establish a standing committee on finance. And this standing committee was established with an objective to assist the Conference of Parties in exercising its functions in relation to financial mechanism of the convention. Now, even under the Paris Agreement, if you refer to that, if you refer to Article 9, Clause 1, it alludes to the continuity, not change, in the state responsibility on the supply of climate finance. With respect to this, I have referred to two nice pieces, and I believe they are of very, good relevance in the current context. One is the Paris Agreement and the Gradual Development of a Law on Climate Finance by Alexander Zahar from Macquarie Law School, Sydney, and there is another one which was of course on the same piece. I believe I'll come across the another one in a while, but the financial obligation part, where he Zahar or rightly noted that the subject of obligation to provide climate finance remains, or more accurately, is affirmed to be the group of the developed countries, that is to say the group collectively, and that is there since Cancun Agreement. In fact, the Paris Agreement also contains a more advanced vision of the role of climate finance in the climate change regime. There you find two elements here. That's the class of contributing states is larger, and the sources of finance are to be more diversified, and the finance is treated as critical to the avoidance of dangerous warning. Now, the standing committee, which I was mentioning, which was established long time back to assist the Conference of Parties in exercising its functions in relation to financial mechanism of the convention, is it plays a very significant role. Why? Because the thing is that if you refer to the Special Climate Fund or all these least developed countries fund, they all need a proper assessment at the same point of time, right? Now, the Standing Committee on Finance, they have four specific functions. The Standing Committee on Finance, they at first assess the Conference of Parties in improving coherence and coordination in delivery of climate change financing. It also assists the Conference of Parties in, say, rationalization of financial mechanisms of the Framework Convention. Thirdly, it supports the Conference of Parties in mobilization of financial resources for climate financing. And finally, it also reports and verifies whatever things which are provided to the developed countries parties. So once again, the four important specific function is the Committee on Finance ensures it improves coherence and coordination in delivery of climate change financing. Secondly, it assists the Conference of Parties in rationalization of the financial mechanism of the Framework Convention. It supports the Conference of Parties in the mobilization of financial resources for climate financing. And finally, it also supports the Conference of Parties in MRV, measurement, reporting, and verification of support provided to the developing country parties. Along with that, there are a few other things that they usually do. They usually conduct periodic reviews, also financial mechanisms. They prepare a biannual assessment also at the same point of time. It also promotes coordination with the financial matter relating to climate change. It's related to the several actors and initiatives, both from inside the convention and also outside the convention. In fact, the Paris Agreement, in Paris Conference, sorry, in 2015, the parties have also decided that this particular Standing Committee on Finance shall also serve the Paris Agreement, and that is what it is. And in addition to that, there is another factor that you should also keep in mind, that there is this long-term finance, climate finance process that has also been created here. Now, this long-term finance process is basically, it's aimed at progressing the mobilization and scaling up of this entire climate finance of resources originating from a wide variety of sources, be it public, be it private, be it bilateral, multilateral. It includes alternative sources also. Now, the Conference of Parties, they decided that on following these activities through to this from 2020 onwards, and the organization by secretariat of annual in workshops and developed country parties providing all these biannual basis information strategies, etc., etc. Everything will be, of course, this things will be taken care by this particular process. And in fact, from 2010, when Cancun Agreement was adopted, the developed country parties also committed that in the context of a very meaningful mitigation actions and ensuring a transparency on implementation, there is a goal that they set that they will mobilize jointly, of course, $100 billion, in fact, for the same. So, $100 billion per year by 2020. Now, here we are, and in order to address the needs of these developing countries, this $100 billion is something I feel like a distant dream. Now, while adopting the Paris Agreement, also the parties confirmed this goal. It, in fact, called this particular goal a concrete roadmap. It, in fact, called for a concrete roadmap to achieve the goal by 2020. And they all agreed that prior to 2025, a new goal that they have set, prior to 2025, the Conference of Parties, which is serving to this particular Paris Agreement, they will set a new collective quantified goal for a floor of $100 billion US dollars per year. So let's see how far they'll go ahead and they will attain this particular goal in the days to come.